we want to deal with the ministry to people who have low self-esteem. Before we can do that, we need to get into some more of the causes of low self-esteem. What you heard us talk about last week was the theological error that causes the low self-esteem. Remember those? Okay, remember the value of human nature was equated when we approach God and when we approach man? Okay, human nature cannot be considered. God does not ask us to consider to look at human nature as if it is being related to the perfectionistic standard of heaven as we relate to human beings. Okay? God is not requiring that. It's when we approach God that the perfect standard is to be applied. Are you with me? That's when we use the word totally and absolutely depraved. There's nothing in us to commend us to God. But when we're working with men, we are more or less. We are better or worse than other men. Are you with me? And listen, you can sit down and talk with a psychologist or a sociologist or an anthropologist, anybody in the social sciences, as long as you're dealing with the definition of man relating to the universe of men. And then you can say, more compared to the universe of men, and you're not in any way compromising your soul to the gospel. I won't compromise. You know me that well enough. All you're doing is understanding what they're relating to. They're not thinking of God's perfect standard when they're talking to you. They're talking about the universe of men. Well, let's use the same definition of terms, okay? So when you're talking to a psychologist, you're talking about man's nature relative to the universe of men. Don't get so shook up when they say man is basically good, okay? I think it's still dumb even in terms of the universe of men. But it's not nearly as shaken up as if it's a man of God saying man is basically good as he's approaching God. You see what I'm saying? Are you with me on that? I hope I don't get anybody upset. But I want you to be able to see the difference. When you're approaching God, you're totally depraved. As you're working with men, there's a relative difference. It's relative. Even though you still are totally depraved and it affects your relationships to men, you don't have to use the perfect standard as you approach man. The second theological error we dealt with was a confusion of self and the flesh. In me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. Myself is different. It's no longer I that does it, Paul says. It's no longer I myself that does sin. It's the principle of sin that lives in me that makes me sin. Are you hearing that? And you got to get rid of that principle of sin, and that's what the whole good news is about. See, pride. We talked about somebody equating pride with a high self-concept, or humility with low self-concept. They're not the same, right? We talked about low self-concept is really a self-deprecating attitude, an unrealistic appraisal of oneself. Isn't that right? Remember that? Not getting many amens in it. Pride is an unrealistic evaluation of oneself, attributing too much to one's own self. It's an unrealistic appraisal on the positive side. And then also, there are some people that believe that you cannot have self-love, and we tried to cover that very hurriedly last time. And that God does say this is a healthy, normal love of ourself that makes us whole people, and it helps us love other people. We tried to cover that and correct those theological errors. Nobody can have a balanced point of view and good self-esteem unless he has those theological errors corrected. That's an important lecture. If you don't have it, try to get somebody's notes or see if you can borrow somebody's tape. Would you stand up, brother? I want them to see who you are. You can borrow his tape or whatever other arrangement you can make. I didn't hear that, but there are rules in the school we really want to conform to, but he does have a tape, access to a tape, and you can work out anything informally with him. I urge you to buy everything through the school if you can, but it's just not available through the school at this time. Okay, my second point is, another cause of low self-esteem is sin. Sin. God's no fun spoiler, but you can be. When you violate God's law, you feel guilty and you feel remorseful. And you feel disappointed with yourself. And that interference with goal-directed behavior, I want to be good, but I didn't do it. That causes anger in ourselves. And then that anger, internalized, becomes depression. And I'm telling you, sin is a biggie cause of low self-esteem, lowered self-esteem. Leads to feelings of inferiority. You feel inferior to the task of living, inferiority to other men's more victoriousness. Other people are more victorious, and you feel less victorious. You feel inferior to the quality of life that you believe in. You just don't feel up to it. And it causes a severe deficit in self-esteem until you confess it and forsake it and get on. Confess it and forsake it. Confess it and forsake it. Confession's not enough. You got to forsake it. And one more thought. When sin has lasted a long time, when you've been sinning a long time, It's been masturbation for years as a single person. It can cause all kinds of lowered self-esteem that will have lasting effects that will take years to heal, sometimes years to heal. I know God can instantly heal, but sometimes the Lord chooses to allow you to be healed over a period of time. Inner healing usually takes a period of time. My wife tells me it was 6 years before I really finally got relief from a lot of the hardships that I'd gone through as a kid. And every night I would wake up and I'd share with her, and the Lord, I'd deal with that issue. The Lord brought from my subconscious into my conscious. Inner healing. And when there's been sin, it can last a long time, the effects. Third thing that can cause low self-esteem, besides theological error and sin, past experience. Past experience. I know this is emphasized in Brother Thompson's deliverance classes. In a society that so highly values a person who realizes his goals, we call success realizing our goals. The definition of success is getting to your goal, right? And we really build up success in this society. Well, if you build success real big, I mean, it's a monumental thing that you strive toward. That makes failure a monumental depressive thing, doesn't it? The bigger success is to you, the bigger failure becomes when you realize it. Are you with me? And so failure is an esteem-robbing experience. And rejection, the rejection that we feel of ourselves, really robs us. Also, another thing that robs us of esteem from past experience is the whole area of rejection. And I know Brother Thompson spends adequate time on this, but the biggest reason why rejection robs us of esteem, self-esteem, is because we ask the question, why am I rejected? What's wrong with me? You know, why don't these people respond the way I'd like them to respond to me? What went wrong? What's wrong with me? Another thing that robs us from past experience, that robs us of self-esteem, is criticism that isn't aimed to improve. Now, I don't mind. I can take the criticism on question number 15 if you really have a desire to improve. But I had one kid tell me, now, a lot of times I get extremes. You know, I'm the best or the worst. And one kid told me, you're the worst teacher I've ever come across in my life. Okay? Now, his desire was not to edify. His desire was not to help, but to hurt. And everything he said after that was really aimed to stick it to me. Well, that can hurt, especially if it goes on for a long period of time. So if it's criticism that's not aimed to improve, and it's not backed up, if it's criticism that's not backed up by loving support, then it has the same effect as rejection. If somebody criticizes you, and they're not trying to help you improve, you're not really convinced they're trying to help you improve, and they don't feel their support, it's just like a rejection. It's just like a rejection experience. So when failure, rejection, and criticism are frequent, so we're talking about past experience, and the three elements are failure, rejection, and criticism. Failure, rejection, and criticism. When they're frequent, it's a real temptation for us to get unrealistic about ourselves. And we have a temptation to deprecate ourselves. Remember? Self-deprecation and unrealistic appraisal of ourselves. I'm really not very good. How could I have let this happen? How can I let people think this way about me? And you come to conclusions about yourself that aren't realistic. Are you with me? If you've had sustained rejection, sustained criticism, sustained failure, a lot of failure. Look at the mess that I've allowed myself to get into. Just think of what people are saying about me. What a jerk I've turned out to be. Past experiences robbing us of self-esteem. Fourth point, parental effect. Parents, parental effect. Most of us form our basic sense of self-esteem in our earliest years in our home. That's really true. You get your basic self-concept and your basic sense of self-esteem in your first years, in your home. And self-esteem robbers of children are, number one, parental inconsistencies. And we're not talking about parents being perfect or imperfect. We're talking about parents being inconsistent in their expression of feelings for their children. Like they're critical at times and warm and accepting at other times, and the children don't understand, okay? Hypercritical, super warm and accepting. Now, minor inconsistencies, they're just temporary blows to the self-concept. There are no lasting problems. It's that sustained criticism we were talking about. It's shaming a child, rejecting him. I remember when I couldn't perform, that there was a tendency sometimes, once in a while, of my parents, to just break off fellowship. Had nothing to do with me, because I made them mad. and constant scolding and threatening. It just builds a dislike in a child for himself. You see, if you keep telling a child he is a rebellious child, you're a rebellious child, you're just nothing more than a rebellious child, and you prophesy to yourself over and over again that child is rebellious, and everything you do, you respond to that child the way you have prophesied about it. It's what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. And while a child all children have tendency to rebel, to not want their little wills crossed, but no child is by nature just a rebellion epitomized. Every single one of your children may be more or less resistive of authority, but there is no just purely rebellious child. But if you believe that, and you start convincing the child, and it lowers his self-esteem. Okay, other robbers of self-esteem by parents in childhood that carries on into adulthood. Let me just give you a list of them real quick. You rob self-esteem in a child when you set unrealistic goals and standards for him. Unrealistic goals and standards. Your child is capable of getting A's when he works, then that's fine. Expect A's. But if that child has to work to get a B, don't beat that kid. Don't beat that kid by requiring him to get an A. Okay? Let the kid be a kid. Let him grow up. Let him enjoy his childhood. Set realistic goals. But unrealistic goals and standards, you want the child to always act perfect when you're in company. You want the child to never act. I got 3 little girls. They're so different. One little girl, I always say to my wife, she should have been a boy. Yes, she's very feminine in many ways, but she's strong and hunky, and she takes after her daddy. Unfortunately, she's just a moosey kid, and yet she's a little girl. And if I expected that little girl to always act feminine, I aspire for her, but if I required her to always act feminine, I would be putting her down all the time. Because it's a rarity to see her act feminine. Isn't that right, Judy? She just doesn't act very feminine. Whereas little Rachel, who takes more after her mama, is kind of a delicate, petite little thing, she's just all the time, everything she does just kind of is feminine, Now, Mary Jo has feminine attitudes. In fact, probably more than the other girls, more feminine in attitude, but in her performance is different. Well, we have to set realistic goals relative to each child. And they have to be realistic. Otherwise, we'll lower their self-esteem. Third thing, we lower a child's self-esteem, which carries on into adulthood, if we express expectations that a child will fail. If we don't expect a child to succeed, he comes to believe it. I'll never forget the damage my folks had a tendency to do. I really think they were trying to work reverse psychology on me, but they said, you'll never get through college. You'll never make it through. You'll never make it through. Now I'm a candidate for the PhD, which is degree number 9. And I always knew that I had to do some things. God had given me a call to get knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, and there was never any doubt. Just because it took me 6 years to get my 4-year degree, and my wife did it in 3, it took me twice as long, doesn't mean that it didn't mean that I wouldn't get it. But if you expect a child to fail, you'll probably get what you expect, and it lowers the kid's self-esteem. Don't expect a child to fail. Readjust his goals, convince him, so he can have a success experience. 4, you will lower a child's self-esteem if you rarely give praise and encouragement. If you rarely give praise and encouragement, if you rarely give a compliment, if you rarely give emotional support, the child's self-esteem will sag. God has placed him in a home with you as mother or father to give him a sound sense of self-esteem, to have a good judgment of self. So you will lower it if you give no praise or little praise, encouragement, compliments, emotional support. And I have to work at it. Sometimes it's easier to holler at my kid and say, what did you do that for? That was a stupid thing to do. Why in the world? What? And this type of thing. It takes effort to praise a child, to find things that he does right, to give him compliments for. Brethren, you'll fall into the same trap that most parents do if you just do what comes naturally, okay? Naturally you'll criticize. Naturally you'll shame. Naturally you'll find fault. It's unnatural to watch for a child to do right and praise him when he does it, okay? But if you love him, you're going to give him that kind of emotional support, that kind of encouragement, whenever you can. It's so easy. Get so busy. I know better. My child comes home with a fistful of decent grades, and I appreciate it. The temptation is when they get the C or the B, and they got other grades that are better, to say, well, how come you got, instead of seeing the 5 A's or the higher grades, how come you got a B here or a C? Or what's the matter? That's a tendency. You got to remember you got that propensity, and it doesn't help them at all. Okay, another thing that can hurt them, and I probably should have said this more positively, but I say I'm being moderated by being in this place, and I will learn to say things more positively. But you can lower their self-esteem by punishing too often, and by punishing harshly. My parents believed, spare the rod, spoil the child, and I don't think they had any other technique other than to. There are 3 things they did to me. They sent me to my room without any supper. And they waited all day to deal with me. Or they pounded my tail. And it was usually the latter. And now that's the only method they had for discipline. Early. Later on, they did give me some financial reward when I got good grades or did well. They'd stick a buck in my hand or something like that. But when you punish often, repeatedly, just constantly pounding a child, or you're harsh, oh, you stupid, kid, like that. Have you ever had that tendency? Oh, when a kid does a stupid thing, and you're tired anyway, and they just spill dinner all over the, and you don't have anything else, and there it is, you're not going to retrieve it. You want to say, you stupid kid, but you don't say that, okay? You just restrain yourself because you're spirit controlled. So don't be harsh. Don't be harsh. Okay, I have to confess too, sometimes I do not let the spirit control, especially when I'm tired. But I can say more and more, I let the spirit control. I learn to let him control more and more. But repeated punishment and harsh punishments lower self-esteem. Another one, when you imply that the kids are a nuisance or stupid, incompetent, when you imply that they're a nuisance, they're getting your way, when you imply that they're kind of stupid, they're not very bright, or when you imply that they're incompetent, they're just not very sharp. They don't know how. A little child says, "I'd like to help cook, Mama," and Mama has a tendency to say, "Honey, you don't know what to do." When you keep constantly implying incompetence, the child will come to believe that he's incompetent. Let the child mess things up a little bit. My wife is really good. You get too much salt, you can put a little sugar in it, kind of counteract the salt. She's good. She's learned a few little tricks like that. And so, didn't we have a kid do a cake not too long ago, and do some things, and they're kind of strange looking, but many times they're palatable, and I think of all the good things that I can say, and even if it's a cake, and I said, this is chewy. Call it surprise cake. You can find something positive to say. Another thing to lower self-esteem is if you avoid cuddling, hugging, and caring touches. I got to confess that by nature, because there was so much, it was just the opposite. In my family, everybody was kissing all the time. You come over to somebody's house, and you'd plant one on everybody. You go around, and everybody has to kiss. That's the kind of home I came out of. And it seems so superficial to me. And my wife comes out of a home where I don't think she saw her mother and father kiss more than a dozen times in front of the kids, right? Maybe not that many. Maybe count them on one hand. There wasn't this outward display. Whatever our reason, she didn't see it very much. I saw it too much, and it just was not sincere. And so I have a tendency not to be cuddly, touchy, and she has a tendency not to be cuddly, touchy by virtue of our different backgrounds. But the kids need hands-on experiences, okay? And that means you get that fella, okay? I don't like to hug fellas. I'm not. I have a tendency not to be warm with my boy, but I can get him around the neck and rub his head. I can, and that's touching. I can grab him and throw him, or swing him around. He needs hands-on experiences. The only trouble is I have the same tendency to do it with my girls, and they don't like it. But don't not hug. Don't not cuddle. And every once in a while I'll call my little girl over just to have them sit down by me and put my arm around her and just say, "I love you." And they just are so good at cuddling. They just seem to be natural. Kids are natural at it, aren't they? But cuddle with them. If you don't, then they're not going to develop a caring for themselves, okay? Show that you care, that you're tender to them. And then they'll develop a normal, healthy caring and tenderness toward themselves. And you need a certain amount of that. See, love others like you love yourselves. You've always been harsh with yourself. You see, you're going to be harsh with others. Did you hear that? And you're doing exactly what God says to do. Love others as you love yourself. You don't love yourself very much, you don't love others very much. You got to have a healthy, normal love of yourself, which is not equatable to pride, which is not equatable to the sin principle. Okay? The sin principle is not self-love. My brother.
It's sort of like your son. It was my experience growing up. I wanted my stepfather to love me. I just wanted him not to. He never even, wrestled with me or anything. But I just wanted him to hug me. I just wanted him to just take me on his chest and just hold me. I needed that. And not that I'm a little funny either.
I understand. That's right. I have to this day. I don't think my dad's ever given me a hug, ever. Never remember it. And I hope one of these days when I see him. Now we're friends. We didn't used to be friends. Now we're friends. And I think he's going to come back into Pentecostal circles. He's studying it. He's thinking about it. I think maybe next time I see my dad, I may grab him and hug him. Instead of taking that big old hand, I just may give him a hug. Me, give my dad a hug. That's really unusual, but he needs it, and I need it. I love the man. Yes, ma'am. Isn't that something? Yeah. It increases the self-esteem. It does a lot of ministry, a lot of healing. It's true. But listen, I want to go the other way, rather than hugging inappropriately. Since I've been here, I have seen every time fellows and gals meet, it's a big old huggy. And men and women, I don't believe, should hug one another, except as an exception. I don't care who you think you are. I know gals get distracted. I've counseled them over and over again. I take them once or twice. Remember, I do take them once or twice before I refer. But I find gals get distracted by the simple little thing of huggies. Now, you can go to either extreme, okay? What we're saying in the home, give them plenty of hugging. I want to give you one more point on this one. I know I have other hands, but I need to finish. You can also overprotect and dominate children. So later they fail because they never were forced to perform. Understand? You can be overly mothering, which means you can be smothering. And overparented children never learn to take responsibility for themselves. Usually first children. Only kids or first kids have excessive reactions. They either get overly protected or overly required overmuch to stand on their own 2 feet. My brother and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I got 5 solid pages of lecture, and I've only covered 2. I'm going to have to take another time. Let me tell you what we're missing, though, by doing this, and I think it's important. And I know I'm not answering questions, but it would extend it. I would need to cover choosing a mate before we get out of here. I need to cover the basics of marriage relationships, okay? I really do need to get into those 2 areas because you'll be counseling with them. So I don't mean to leave out your hands by pushing hard on. And I'm not trying to discriminate against you, but we've got so much to cover. If you could be understanding, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. We're dismissed.